This is Chthonia, the world of the dark feminine.
Hello, this is Breach Burke. Before we get into this week's podcast, I would like to thank my patrons personally: Politi, John H., Tanya T., Veronica S., Jeffrey B., Gabby, Helen M., Sunny H., Scott K., JRM, Susie G., Eldritch Priest, B. Lupita, C. Roberts, Jeanette, DS, Jake B., CDV, Ali, V! V, Mary Beth R., Ida B., Eric N., Tana, May, and Christine F. I really appreciate those of you who have joined recently and who have stuck with me over these years. Our community is small, and there's so much I would like to do in terms of providing courses, conversations on the dark feminine, and extra content, so please consider joining at patreon.com/Chthonia. Now on to the podcast. Hello and welcome to Chthonia, the podcast that deals with the dark feminine. My name is Breach Burke, and just realizing as I'm putting this together that we're almost on 6 years of Chthonia. In May 2025, we will be, I've been doing this for 6 years, and wow, it seems to be an endless supply of material that we have for this particular podcast. Or I don't know, maybe at some point it won't prove to be endless, or I'll have to shift track, but yeah, so interesting thought. This is not the first podcast of 2025, of course, but it's definitely something that crossed my mind this morning as I was putting together my notes for this one. So, okay, the subject this week is going to be Pope Joan. Now, last week we talked about Joan of Arc, who was a saint who ended up being burned as a heretic because she put on men's clothes and went to war. Never mind that she defeated the English when the French were having a hard time. Never mind that she installed Charles VII on the throne. As soon as she started to have a change of fortune, she was quickly cast aside to the enemies, and later, like I said, later burned at the stake for the crime of having worn men's clothes, which interestingly is the only thing that they could pin on her as a heresy. So after talking about that remarkable story and my feelings about that last time, we're going to do Pope Joan, which is actually the second request that I have in this particular group of requests. And Pope Joan is, as the name implies, she supposedly was a female pope, the only female pope of the Catholic Church. Now, the dates during which she was supposed to be pope, they vary. Okay, some of them, and we're going to go over all the different variations. Actually, no, I was about to start talking about this in a different way, and then I was like, no, let's try to keep things in order here, because I do have this tendency to kind of jump around a bit. So I think I want to start with the story of Pope Joan. Now, the question of whether she was truly a real pope or whether this was a piece of folklore or fiction is still up for debate today. Now, most scholars treat the story as fictional. The Catholic Church says there's no possible place in the timeline where she supposedly lived that would actually enable her to legitimately have been pope during that time period. Again, similar to Joan of Arc, and it's interesting, these are sort of female names for John, really. Joan is like Johanna. It's there's another. This is like a feminine version of John, and in fact, it was said the name of this pope, this woman disguised as a man, would have been John Anglicus, I think is what they said the name would have been, Pope John, but actually it turns out it was Pope Joan. So we'll explain how that allegedly came about. There's more than one story about how allegedly there came to be a female pope. And the subtext of those stories is quite interesting, because the things that we learn about this woman, if she did indeed exist, and if she was indeed a pope, what similarities we can see between her and the Joan of Arc story, and what this says about the idea of a feminine leader in the Catholic Church. Again, if you wanted to suspend disbelief, or if you wanted to assume that maybe that most evidence probably would have been erased, and maybe there is no evidence The Catholic Encyclopedia, of course, gives its litany of reasons why they're pretty sure that this is a myth. And they could be right. I'm not necessarily making an argument one way or the other for her existence in this podcast. We're just going to look at the evidence, and you can really make up your own mind as to whether or not you think she was a real historical figure or whether or not this was just a legend. But either way, even if we want to look at it from the point of view of a legend, then it's quite an interesting one, still in terms of what it says and what it tells us about attitudes towards the idea of a female pope, and what kinds of things she was accused of. Like what, other than pretending to be a man and then becoming pope, I mean, what are her other crimes here? What are these things that we're seeing? And what were her characteristics? Because I think all of this is really interesting in getting a vision of the Catholic Church and the context of its leadership, and the way in which you could have a woman infiltrate this system, potentially. What it really says about the perception of women, what women were capable of, what women's roles were, and it does sort of touch on the whole topic of women and their role in the Catholic Church when it comes to leadership of any kind, especially in the context of other saints in the Middle Ages. Now, Pope Joan, of course, is not considered to be a saint. Again, she's not even necessarily considered to be a historical personage. There's some doubt about that. And a lot of energy has gone into saying that Pope Joan never existed. And again, I don't want to imply any kind of conspiracy theory here, but I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting idea. I do sort of agree that the timings on this don't seem to fit in very, very neatly, but the possibility that something like this could have happened is, I don't know. I don't think it's entirely out of the question, but I would think that if it did turn out to be a thing, there would definitely be an effort to suppress that on the part of the church, because clearly that would have been an error that was made by people, the learned holy men of the Holy See. So anyway, enough of me editorializing. Let's get on to the actual facts here. I am working between Wikipedia and Catholic Encyclopedia. A lot of the information is the same, but there are some differences. Catholic Encyclopedia is just flat out, this is a mythical story. But they do both discuss where this story has been told, and the Catholic Encyclopedia does give what they think may be the potential origin of the story. So all of that's going to factor in, and then we're going to kind of look at this as we go along and see what we think. Okay, so let me start with the Wikipedia one. It says Pope Joan, Ioannis Anglicus. Now again, supposedly the years 855 to 857. Let me be clear that that's just one version of the story and not the earliest one. Was an anti-Catholic legend about a woman who purportedly reigned as pope for 2 years during the Middle Ages. Her story first appeared in chronicles in the 13th century and subsequently spread throughout Europe. The story was widely believed for centuries, but most modern scholars regard it as fictional. Most versions of her story describe her as a talented and learned woman who disguised herself as a man, often at the behest of a lover. In the most common accounts, owing to her abilities, she rose through the church hierarchy and was eventually elected pope. Her sex was revealed when she gave birth during a procession, and she died shortly after, either through murder or through natural causes. The accounts state that later church processions avoided this spot, and that the Vatican removed the female pope from its official lists and crafted a ritual to ensure that future popes were male. In the 16th century, Siena Cathedral featured a bust of Joan among other pontiffs. This was removed after protests in 1600. That's interesting. There do seem to be some images out here of Pope Joan. Obviously, these will be ones that'll be included in the YouTube version of this podcast. But the question is whether or not this is somebody's fancy and imagination or whether this is based on anything real. But anyways, 16th century would have been much later, so we just have to assume this is an imaginative thing. Okay, Jean de Mailly's chronicle, written around 1250, contains the first mention of an unnamed female pope and inspired several more accounts over the next several years. The most popular and influential version is that interpolated into Martin of Opava's Chronicon Pontificum et Imperatorum later in the 13th century. Martin introduced details that the female pope's birth name was John Anglicus of Mens, that she reigned in the 9th century, and that she entered the church to follow her lover. The existence of Pope Joan was used in defense of Walter Brut in his trial of 1391. The legend was generally accepted as true until the 16th century, when a widespread debate among Catholic and Protestant writers called the story into question. Various writers noted the implausibly long gap between Joan's supposed lifetime and her first appearance in texts. Protestant scholar David Blondel ultimately demonstrated the impossibility of the story. Pope Joan is now widely considered fictional, though the legend remains influential. Okay, so let's go through the stories. Where's this female pope mentioned? So we're starting here, again, the Dominican monk Jean de Mailly's Chronicle of Metz, Chronica Universalis Mettensis, written in the early 13th century. In his telling, the female pope is not named, and the events are set in 1099. According to Jean, concerning a certain pope, or rather female pope, who is not set down in the list of popes or bishops of Rome, because she was a woman who disguised herself as a man, and became, by her character and talents, a curial secretary, and then a cardinal, and then finally a pope. One day, while mounting a horse, she gave birth to a child. Immediately, by Roman justice, she was bound by the feet to the horse's tail, and dragged and stoned by the people for half a league, and where she died, there she was buried. And at the place it is written, Petre, patre patrum, papisse, prodito partum. O Peter, father of fathers, betray the childbearing of the woman pope. At the same time, the 4-day fast called for the fast of the female pope was first established. Okay, now that is from this Jean de Mailly. So, interesting. In this particular version, supposedly she's right, 1099, 1100. So we're really talking the end of the 9th, beginning of the 10th century, or really 10th into 11th century. Actually later than that, 11th and 12th. I always get my numbers backwards because, it's like the 8th century is actually like the 900s and so on and so forth. It's like it's one before, obviously, because 0 through 100 would be the 1st century, and then 100 through 200 would be the 2nd century, and so forth. So so this is something that we're talking about right during during probably what would have been the 11th century. So, so the story, so it says this story is picked up by his fellow Dominican, Stephen of Bourbon, who adapted it for his work on the 7 gifts of the Holy Ghost. However, the legend gained its greatest prominence when it appeared in its 3rd recension, which of course is a type of revision or editorial, of Martin of Opava's Chronicon Pontificum et Imperatorum later in the 13th century. This version, which may have been by Martin himself, is the first to attach a name to the figure, indicating that she was known as John Anglicus or John of Mens. It changed the date from the 11th to the 9th century, indicating that Joan reigned between Leo IV and Benedict III in the 850s. According to the Chronicon, John Anglicus, born at Mens, was a pope for 2 years, 7 months, and 4 days, and died in Rome, after which there was a vacancy in the papacy, well, that's an interesting alliteration there, of 1 month. It is claimed that this John was a woman who, as a girl, had been led to Athens dressed in the clothes of a man by a certain lover of hers. There she became proficient in a diversity of branches of knowledge, until she had no equal. Afterward in Rome, she taught the liberal arts and had great masters among her students and audience. A high opinion of her life and learning arose in the city. She was chosen for pope. While pope, however, she became pregnant by her companion. Through ignorance of the exact time when the birth was expected, she was delivered of a child while in procession from St. Peter's to the Lateran in a lane once named Via Sacra, the Sacred Way, but is now known as the Shunned Street between the Colosseum and St. Clement's Church. After her death, it said she was buried in the same place. The Lord Pope always turns aside from the street, and it is believed by many that this is done because of abhorrence of the event. Nor is she placed on the list of holy pontiffs, both because of her female sex and on account of the foulness of the matter, which is interesting. Okay, so in this version of the story, this is where we see John Anglicus. We see this name come up, and which then becomes Johanna or Joan. And and now we've added a sexual dimension to this story. Although in the original legend by Jean de Mailly, he says that she does give birth to a child. So there is the implication that she is not chaste, that she is sexually active. We see this in both of these stories. In this one, though, we add that it's a lover who is trying to be deceptive. So clearly, this is going to be a situation where Joan is not involved in. In other words, she's not chaste. She's not properly married. She's a young girl who runs off with her lover. Okay, so we've already got this idea that she is this kind of sexually sovereign kind of being, or in some fashion, that she's trying to gain that. And putting on the clothes of a man, to me, is again, that's part of that sovereignty, part of saying, I can have the independence and stature and do the same things that a man can do. I can make my own choices and decisions, which, of course, in the Middle Ages, that wasn't really the way things went for women. Certainly a good, pious Catholic woman would be one who would be submissive first to her family and then to her husband, and, of course, have children and so forth. But interestingly, both of them indicate that she was a very learned woman of ability. So it's not the idea that she's just she's a woman who's some kind of, I'm going to use the phrase baby-making machine just because there is an attitude in some quarters that is women's role and duty is to produce children. So again, and not to be flippant or dismissive of people who have families that they love. I'm not trying to be that way, but at the same time, there's the idea that if you were a woman, that was a foregone conclusion that was your life purpose and your duty. And so she does have a child, but the implication is that these children are born out of wedlock, okay, and that this is somebody who's taking up holy orders of the church and engaging in this, which is like a double indemnity here, and then committing the heresy of wearing men's clothes. But clearly, she was so good at what she did that she was able to. She learned all the sciences. She taught at university. People respected her opinion, and it's really interesting. But the thing that ends up degrading her is giving birth to a child. And again, for all the reasons that we mention in terms of what the rules are supposed to be. Childbirth and such is always viewed as something profane, even as there is a dictum in the Old Testament to be fruitful and multiply. And even though there is a dictum, even within Christian doctrine about giving birth, bearing children, having families, things like that, certainly it was something St. Paul looked down on. He felt that a good Christian should always be celibate, and only if it was really necessary to have a family. That was the only time it should be okay. But otherwise, all Christians should abstain and be celibate, which tells you probably a lot about St. Paul. Yeah, that has been the dictum, and some people claim that this is part of the reason that, and also the claim that Jesus was celibate, a claim that nobody can prove because nobody, other than what the Gospels tell us, and we also realize that in addition to the synoptics, which are the ones in the Bible, there are many other Gospels that tell us Jesus did have female partners and so forth, but if we go on the idea that is mentioned in the canonical Bible, and the one that we see, then there's the idea that Jesus never married, and so therefore, and that his disciples were all male, even though, again, we know he had female disciples. There's the idea that, well, because Jesus was a man and his disciples who served him were men, then in the church it should be the same thing. Men should be celibate, and the people who serve should only be men, and women are only allowed to take orders as nuns. And nuns have to be subservient to the priests. They're not, the priests are their confessors. Like a nun cannot give confession. A nun cannot say mass and consecrate the host. Okay, she's not given that kind of power. Nun takes a vow of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Okay, so not only is she not going to marry, because she's considered to be a quote-unquote bride of Christ, but she's also expected to be obedient to the order. And they say a vow of poverty. Most nuns I know don't live in poverty, but they're not necessarily living lavish lifestyles either. I guess it depends on the diocese, right? There's this, the idea of what men and women's roles were as far as the church went. And certainly, of course, if you want to get into secular life and university life, women were not considered to be, they were not hired to be university professors and instructors. That was not part of what women were not to have that kind of learning. But clearly this woman comes from Athens. She becomes proficient in branches of knowledge. So this means she went and got herself educated, right? Right, and there was a high opinion of her life and learning. So this was a woman who could excel at things to a degree that men wanted to learn from her. Okay, so this is very interesting. It's almost like she is what they would have considered. Okay, now again, we're going by social roles and social expectations about men and women. She would have been considered to be it's almost like I think about Jesus's phrase that, and it's in one of the Gnostic Gospels, when they say that Mary Magdalene doesn't belong among them, and they said, well, she's made herself like a man. And if you go back to my Chthonia conversations with Dan Hanley on Gnosticism, he has a different interpretation of what that phrasing might mean. And women did, truthfully, in ancient Rome, have a certain kind of status. They did, they could be owners of businesses. They were frequently patrons. Cicero, the famous orator, his patron was a woman. You could have women who came from aristocratic families and had a lot of money and could be independent in their own right. So it's not that wasn't a thing in Roman culture, but certainly within church culture, there was the expectation that, yes, if you didn't go to a convent and take holy orders, that you were going to be married and have a family. And most people wanted you to be married because you were a commodity to be bought and sold. There were dowries and things for marriage. Whether or not such a thing took place in the peasant classes, I don't know. Might have been a little bit different, but nonetheless, there's this. We know what the status of women was, and some might argue still is, or at least some people want to make it that again. But the idea that a woman could not only attain to university learning, but also become pope, it's now what is talked about is like, well, it's just an incredible idea. And when we think about the structure of the institution, we can say, yeah, that is an incredible idea. And again, there still question remains as to whether or not this happened. But when we see this, it's so interesting that this is talked about like it is a major abomination. Like this is blasphemy beyond blasphemy, because it's something that happens secretly in defiance of all of the rules. This is not something that can be like, and that allegedly the procession from St. Peter's to the Lateran, the Via Sacra, is now like soiled by the presence of this woman. And the thing that reveals her is that she gives birth to a child and all that implies. Okay, so it's interesting that this, if we want to call her a fictional pope, that she ends up representing womanhood, woman who tries to make herself like a man, but it's the childbearing that gives her away. And the childbearing is also an implication that with her learning and knowledge also comes a kind of, I don't necessarily want to say sexual deviance, but somebody who is not submitting herself to proper marriage or authority and trying to enter the church in a manner that's supposed to be inappropriate for women. So that's very interesting. Okay. So, all right, so let's move on. It says, one version of the Chronicon gives an alternative fate for the female pope. She did not die immediately after her exposure, but was confined and deposed, after which she did many years of penance. Now, this is interesting. Her son from the affair eventually became the Bishop of Ostia and ordered her entombment in his cathedral when she died. So this is interesting. Her son, who would have been considered a kind of, I don't like to use the word bastard, but that's the word that they used. They referred to them as bastard children, illegitimate children. In medieval times, that's the way it would have been. Things. I mean, obviously, that's a pejorative term, and we would not use it today. There's plenty of situations. Marriage is not required to bear a child who is legitimate, but in this particular system, that's the way they would have looked at it. And so she's given a church burial. Initially, she's not given a church burial. It's almost like the witches. She's given she's buried where she fell. Or she is treated in such a way that the implication is that she does not get a proper Christian burial, but that her son eventually gives it to her. Now, that's an interesting idea. Now, about this Bishop of Ostia, I'm going to just check on this for a minute. It's within the metropolitan city of Rome. I mean, I don't know which one. I'm just looking. It just basically just mentions that this is the see. I thought I would like look at the link and say, do they tell me something else about the Bishop of Ostia? But this is within Rome itself. And interesting that such a child would be brought up in the church and be given this kind of upbringing, given the crime his mother supposedly committed within the church. What does that say about her status that he wasn't just, I don't know, cast out somewhere? That instead he was brought into the church? Maybe you could say, okay, well, if that they were trying to save this child who was born in this unfortunate circumstance by raising him in the church, maybe you could say that. But very interesting. Okay, other references to the female pope are attributed to earlier writers, though none appears in manuscripts that predate the Chronica. The most commonly cited is Anastasius Bibliothecarius. Oh, that's an interesting name, like basically Anastasius of the books, or of the library, who died in 886, a compiler of the Liber Pontificalis, who is a contemporary of the female pope by the Chronicons' dating. However, the story is found in only one unreliable manuscript of Anastasius. This manuscript in the Vatican Library bears the relevant passage inserted as a footnote at the bottom of a page. It is out of sequence and in a different hand, one that dates from after the time of Martin of Opava. This quote-unquote witness to the female pope is likely to be based on Martin's account and not a possible source for it. The same is true of Mariana Scotus's The Chronicle of the Popes, a text written in the 11th century. Some of its manuscript contains a brief mention of a female pope named Johanna, the earliest source to attach her to the female form of the name, but all these manuscripts are later than Martin's. Earlier manuscripts do not contain the legend. Okay, so we're getting a sense of the dating of this legend, and it just seems like nobody really heard anything about this before the 11th century, even though allegedly she existed it was a pope in the 9th century, although again, in some versions she was a pope in the 11th century. It still was some significant time afterwards, 12th and 13th century, before people really started to believe this. It says, okay, so some versions of the legend, you're going to like this, suggest that subsequent popes were subjected to an examination whereby, having sat in a so-called sedia stercoraria, or a dung chair, containing a hole, a cardinal had to reach up and establish that the new pope had testicles before announcing, duos habet et pene pendentis. He has two and they dangle nicely. Wow, what if they didn't dangle nicely? Anyway, or habet, he has them, for short. Well, actually, habet could be male or female because the T ending on the verb is the pronouns he, she, or it. And so it could be saying she has them too, I don't know. Anyway, that just came into my head. Yeah, she's got them. Okay. But yes, so apparently, that this is the quote-unquote ritual, I guess, that was referred to earlier. There were associated legends as well. In the 1290s, the Dominican Robert of Uzes recounted a vision in which he saw the seat where it is said the Pope is proved to be a man. Pope Joan has been associated with marvelous happenings. Petrarch, who wrote 1304 to 1374, or that's when he lived, really, wrote in his Chronica de la Vita de Pontifici et Imperatori Romani that after Pope Joan had been revealed as a woman, in Brescia it rained blood for 3 days and nights. In France there appeared marvelous locusts, which had 6 wings and very powerful teeth. They flew miraculously through the air and all drowned in the British Sea. The golden bodies were rejected by the waves of the sea and corrupted the air, so that a great many people died. Okay, this is Petrarch. Although it says the attribution of this work to Petrarch might be incorrect. Okay. Nonetheless, think about this. Okay, female pope, it rains blood. Okay, I always think the idea of a rain of blood, actually, you know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of the First Battle of Moytura with the Morrigan. That supposedly one of the ways that she terrifies the army that they're fighting, and it's not the Fomorian army in that one, it is the Firbolgs that the Tuatha Dé Danann are fighting in that battle, that it rains blood. Now, the raining blood is something we've heard of in different places, and blood, of course, has a very strongly Chthonic association as well. Now, naturally, when people would see, if something like that were to actually occur in nature, and you'll probably find accounts in different places where, raining blood, raining frogs, raining all kinds of weird stuff, that supposedly these kind of anomalies do happen occasionally, and what the explanations are for them. I mean, there's not really any good ones. So we could say that this is just, a fictionalized omen, or maybe if it really did happen, very interesting. And the locusts. Now, locusts, you have to remember that these kinds of signs are sometimes considered to be signs of the end times. So these are locusts. Okay, 6 wings. Wonder if that specifically is significant. And powerful teeth. So, I mean, yeah, I'm thinking of the 6 association there. And 6 is, I don't know. I mean, it's a, I don't know. To me, it's like a macrocosmic kind of a number. 6, 5 within 6, and that makes, 11. So, I don't know. Interesting. But they're golden. So these are kind of like some kind of, we'll just say there's some kind of mutant locusts, and that these apparently were such abominations that a great many people died. I just wonder about the symbolism of that. But yeah, so it's almost like it brings a rain of blood and a plague of these bizarre mutant locusts, let's just say. The symbolism of that is something that one would think about in terms of locusts and what they tend to represent. Locusts are really insects that will come and destroy crops. So it's almost like they bring destruction rather than creation. They are, when if locusts attack your fields, then there's probably going to be, it's usually a sign of famine. So, and these are like super locusts. But this time it's just that they are, in this case, it's not that they're destroying the crops, they're corrupting the air. And again, the idea of these beings that corrupt the air, these flying beings that corrupt the air, remind me also of what I've read about them, Oregon, about the idea of spirits of the air and or demons of the air. That was kind of an idea of these figures that were associated with the air and had these kind of very negative qualities, or these demonic qualities. Okay, so that is the supposed fallout from this, but again, how historically accurate that is. Almost the implication that having a female, having this woman manage to ascend to the papacy was going to bring about the end of the world. I mean, that's almost kind of what the implication is there. Interesting. Okay, later development. From mid-13th century onwards, it was widely disseminated and believed. Joan was used as an exemplum in Dominican preaching. Bartolomeo Platina, the scholar who was prefect of the Vatican Library, wrote his Vitae Pontificum Platinae Historici Liber de Vita Christi ac Hominum Pontificum qui hac tenis ducenti fueri 20 in 1479. Okay, really long Latin title there. Sorry, I didn't mean to rattle off the whole thing. At the behest of his patron, Pope Sixtus IV. The book contains the following account of the female pope. Pope John VIII, John of English extraction, was born at Mentz and is said to have arrived at popedom by evil art, for disguising herself like a man, whereas she was a woman. She went when young with her paramour, a learned man, to Athens, and made such progress in learning that under the professors there that coming to Rome, she met with few that could equal, much less go beyond her, even in the knowledge of the scriptures. And by her learned and ingenious readings and disputations, she acquired so great respect and authority that upon the death of Pope Leo IV, as Martin says, by common consent she was chosen by Pope in his room. As she was going to the Lateran Church between the Colosseum Theater, so called from Nero's Colossus, notice that they have to make a mention of Nero here, and St. Clement's, her travail came upon her, and she, her labor, and she died upon the place, having sat 2 years, 1 month, and 4 days, and was buried there without any pomp. The story is vulgarly told, but by very uncertain and obscure authors, and therefore I have related it barely and in short, lest I should seem obstinate and pernicious if I had admitted what is so, pertinacious, if I had admitted what is so generally talked. I had better mistake with the rest of the world, though it be certain what I have related may be thought not altogether incredible. Okay. So it's like he's mentioning it, even though there seems to be some discussion of whether if it's veracity, whether or not it's true. And it's interesting that, in this particular version, her learning in the scriptures and everything surpasses the learning of the men. And she's coming as this paramour. So again, think about the archetypes or just the even stereotypes we have around the dark feminine. Dark feminine is a motif. It is going to be a woman who is not necessarily going to be sexually submissive to a man. Now, of course, she does have a lover here, and she's coming with her lover, but they have not engaged in what the church would consider this to be illegitimate. There's no bonds of holy matrimony. And he is a learned man, so he is of a more secular mind, right? More rationalist mind, taking this lover with him, and she's allowed to go dressed as a man to school with him, and she manages to have a knowledge that surpasses. Really, now, okay, if we take the historical piece of it out, there's also an incredulity about whether or not that a woman could actually achieve this, which is why it's considered to be kind of an anti-pope story. That, look, you have this woman can surpass your popes, right? And but you could also look at it if we think about the way in which women who excelled in the fields that men excelled in, or surpassed them in things that were supposed to be reserved for men, like university learning, or like Joan of Arc with going to war at such young ages too, that they are then considered to be, actually in Joan's case, it was considered to be a sign of heresy or a sign of witchcraft. Right? The idea that you could, now in Joan's case, she had the visions that were attested to, although at her trial they declared them all to be heretical and from the fiend and all that kind of stuff. But that would be the other assumption. There's something devilish about a woman who could rise up to this station and surpass all of the men. And the fact that you have these kinds of omens associated with her that seem to have to do with these feminine air spirits. Now, again, I'm not making any suggestion here that the people in France know anything about the Morrigan or any of that kind of story. She's just the example that immediately comes to mind of one of these stories about the powers of women who have the quote-unquote powers of the devil, or the powers that would have been perceived by a medieval church as being devilish rather than something that would be natural and inherent to women. We have to remember, too, a goddess like Morrigan is a goddess of sovereignty. So she was the one, and she represented, along with Queen Maeve and some of the others, the deities that... or the deities or the legendary queens that granted sovereignty. And here, it's not that Pope Joan grants any kind of sovereignty, but she does become the authority for the entire Catholic Church, allegedly, for 2 years. Now, historiosity aside, there's a lot to kind of think about there, about what is the moral of that story? Is the moral of the story that she is a practicing witch of some kind, or that she is aided by the devil? Is she some kind of sign of the end times? The fact that she would rise to the papacy? Is it because there is this crossing of boundaries here? Again, the whole idea of cross-dressing. Being a woman and taking on the appearance of a man to, as we've said, quote-unquote, raise herself up. That if she's taking on that and can excel and even surpass men, what exactly is that saying? Is it meant to be an anti-Catholic thing to say, there's a woman who's smarter than your popes? You know what I mean? Like, I don't know if that's sort of the implication there. But nonetheless, the fact that she was this woman who, again, assuming she existed, if she had the kind of sovereignty that they say that she had, that she could run away with her lover, that she could engage in all this learning, that she could move up in a hierarchy where women were not allowed, that she could achieve an office, that even cardinal. I mean, those are not offices that women are allowed. And so what is that actually saying? Is it meant to be an anti-Catholic statement? Because certainly it's mentioned that Protestant writers used this story to say, to be critical of the Catholic Church, and it was at that time period that when the Church defended itself, basically not by saying that there was this extraordinary woman, but by simply claiming the story was false. It's interesting. It's what is the moral there? Is it meant to be something to kind of shame the Church in some way? Or was it meant to be something, a cautionary tale about the powers of the devil, about the powers having to do with the end times, about deception, okay, about how the way in which all of these men were deceived? And of course, that's an embarrassment, so now we're going to try to pretend that it didn't happen. So anyway, it's interesting. Let me go over to the Catholic Encyclopedia, because I want to talk about the, where they do talk about it if you look at it, newadvent.org, and if you look up Pope Joan. it says that, again, they give several proofs as to why, actually two specific proofs why this is mythical in character. And they're noting that nothing was mentioned of her till the middle of the 13th century. If it was historical fact, would be none. They said it would be incredible that it would not be, if it was historical fact, it would be noticed by none of the historians from 10th to 13th century. Well, yeah, maybe. that could be a convincing argument. Maybe not. In the history of popes, they're saying there's no place where she will fit in. So they go through all of the different permutations and say, nah, the time periods don't really match up. But you never know. If this is something they wanted to cover up, they could have extended the reign of one or the other. So, anyway. Okay, so let's go down to the origin of the legend. The fable of a Roman Papess seems to have an earlier counterpart, at Constantinople. Indeed, in his letter to Michael Carolarius, Leo IX said that he would not believe what he had heard, namely that the Church of Constantinople had already seen eunuchs, indeed even a woman, in its episcopal chair. So it says, concerning the origin of the whole legend of Papess Joan, different hypotheses have been advanced. Okay, now before I even get into this one, so we're talking about the split church. There were two churches back in, they're saying 1053, that there was a Byzantine church, a Byzantine Orthodox church, we think of now as a Greek and maybe even Russian Orthodox, comes from the eastern part of what used to be the Roman Empire, and the western part of the empire was dominated by the Roman Catholic Church. And so during the Dark Ages of Europe, where there was little documentation, civilization was flourishing in the Eastern Church. And so this is where we have this idea that within the Orthodox Church that there had already been eunuchs, which would be men who are, castrated, and indeed even a woman in its episcopal chair. Now, the idea that a eunuch could not be pope is interesting. Yeah, especially since there's the whole idea of eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven, which is I think that is one of Paul's letters. You must become eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven, but of course, as Carl Jung has pointed out about that statement, he said, well, that actually goes back to the priests of the goddess Cybele, who would castrate themselves, the Gali they were known as. And so, in a way, it's almost like they're becoming like the Gali, which of course would be the types of priests who are worshiping a female goddess, right? So they've already had eunuchs, which is almost this implication of this type of priest. Although again, priests are supposed to be celibate. So I mean, I realize in the Anglican tradition and so forth, and a lot of Protestant traditions, those who are, well, the priests certainly in the Anglican and Episcopal communities do not have to be, they can be married. I mean, they don't have to be celibate. But that in Roman Catholic tradition, they still do. So, So interesting. So the idea is that there's a letter to Pope Leo IX mentions that people have said that there was already a female pope. So they think maybe this could be the origin of the legend. I don't know. That seems a little bit of a stretch. Okay. So here's the legend. They say Bellarmine believes that the tale was brought from Constantinople to Rome. Baronius conjectures that much of the censured effeminate weaknesses of Pope John VIII, who ruled from 872 to 82, in dealing with the Greeks, may have given rise to the story, like claiming that he was really a woman. And there you go. But then again, somebody who rose to prominence because of their erudite learning, that doesn't really square up the idea that, they were saying he's weak, so they were calling him a girl, basically. Mai has shown that Photius of Constantinople refers emphatically 3 times to this pope as the manly, as though he would remove from him the stigma of effeminacy. So, so almost there's this idea that this pope is called feminine, and there's this need to assert this pope as masculine and manly. Okay, other historians point to the degradation of the papacy in the 10th century when so many popes bore the name John. It seemed therefore a fitting name for the legendary Papess. Thus, Aventius sees the story as a satire on John IX, Blondel a satire on John XI, Panvinio applies it to John XII, while Leander understands it as applicable generally to the baneful female influence on the papacy during the 10th century. Now, that's interesting. So what's the baneful influence? Well, we do know that this is a time of a lot of female Christian mystics and saints who had a lot of political power, certainly throughout the Middle Ages. Some of these doctors of the church, like Catherine of Siena, like Teresa of Avila. I mean, some of these come a bit later, but you do definitely have these saintly figures from these time periods who are women, and whose, because of their saintly visions and the things that have happened to them, they end up having a kind of clout in the church that women maybe typically did not have, because supposedly their close relationship to God is what gives them this kind of authority, right? But they're calling it this baneful female influence. I would love to read more of Leander to find out. The reference given is Kirchengesch. Then there's a Roman numeral 200, so volume 2 of something, page 200. I actually do want to go back and check that one. I'm interested to know about the baneful female influence on the papacy in the 10th century. Like, what exactly does he mean by that? I can actually look down at the references here. So, no, they just gave the citations. They don't tell the other. Okay. Anyway, I'm going to have to look into that one, because I just find that maybe that'll be my follow-up for the live stream next week to talk about that. Okay. So it says, other investigators endeavor to find in various occurrences and reports a more definite basis for the origin of this legend. Leo Alatius connects it with the false prophetess Theota, condemned at the Synod of Mentz in 847. Leibniz recalls the story that an alleged bishop, Johannes Anglicus, came to Rome and was there recognized as a woman. Okay, so Dollinger's explanation is met with more general approval. He recognizes the fable of Pope Joan as a survival of some local Roman folktale originally connected with certain ancient monuments and peculiar customs. An ancient statue discovered during the reign of Sixtus V in a street near the Colosseum, which showed a figure with a child, was popularly considered to represent the Papess. In the same street, a monument was discovered with an inscription at the end which occurred the well-known formula PPP, properi pecunia posuit, together with the prefix name which read Papyrus Pater Patrum. So going back to that little rhyme that was supposedly written before. This could have easily given origin to the inscription mentioned by Jean de Mailly. It was also observed that the Pope did not pass along this street in solemn procession, perhaps on account of its narrowness. Further, it was noted that, on the occasion of his formal inauguration in front of the Lateran Basilica, the newly elected Pope only seated himself on a marble chair. This seat was an ancient bath stool, of which there were many in Rome. It was merely made use of by the Pope to rest himself, but the imagination of the vulgar took this to signify that the sex of the Pope was thereby tested, in order to prevent any further instance of a woman attaining to the chair of St. Peter. Erroneous explanations will not be dignified by, since the middle century dignified by consigning it to their pages. Uncritical chroniclers, though. Yeah, clearly the guy who wrote this is not a fan of Pope Joan. But those are some of the ideas about the origin story, suggesting that they may have come from other folk tales, maybe tales of a female pope in Constantinople, and some of these other ideas saying, oh, okay, well, this became the pretext for this particular legend. So again, now let's just go move on. We have the Protestant writers. They would take up the Pope. It says various authors in the 16th and 17th centuries occupied themselves with Pope Joan, but it was from the point of view of the polemic engaged between the partisans of Lutheran or Calvinist reform and the apologists of Catholicism. And again, I'm not going to delve into those. We are kind of running long on this podcast, so I don't want to get into all of the things about, because you can obviously see how, if such a story were true, how the Protestants would use that to show the moral failing of the Catholic Church, right? Okay, so let's just look at recent analysis and critique. It says most scholars of the 20th and 21st centuries dismissed Pope Joan as a medieval legend. British historian John Julius Norwich dismissed the myth with a logical assessment of evidence. The Oxford Dictionary of Popes declares that there is no contemporary evidence for a female pope at any of the dates suggested for her reign, but nonetheless acknowledges that Pope Joan's legend was widely believed for centuries, even by Catholics. We hear a lot about why this story is false. Let's just see who thinks that maybe it's true. Let's see. They were talking about how the legend about that street was a legend of Pope Joan was still current in Rome. Okay, I'm just going to go to the end of this here. It says, although some medieval writers referred to the female pope as John VIII, a genuine Pope John VIII reigned between 872 and 882. Due to the scarcity of records in the early Middle Ages, confusion often reigns in the evaluation of events. The Pope Joan legend is also conflated with the gap in the numbering of the Johns. In the 11th century, Pope John the 14th was mistakenly counted as two popes. He's twice the Pope. twice the Pope action. Anyway, sorry. When Petrus Hispanus was elected Pope in 1276, he believed there had already been 20 popes named John, so he skipped the 20 and called himself John the 21st. I don't know why this reminds me of the last scene of Life of Brian, where everybody wants to know who they say, who's Brian? I'm Brian. No, I'm Brian. I'm Brian, and so is my wife. I don't know why it just reminds me of that, but anyway, it's kind of funny. And I don't actually, knowing Monty Python and their knowledge of history, even though this was a reference to Brian on the cross and everything, it just, yeah, anyway. I do wonder if there's some kind of a thing. Okay, in 2018, Michael E. Habicht, an archaeologist at Flinders University, published new evidence in support of a historical Pope Joan. Habicht and graphoanalyst Marguerite Speicher analyzed papal monograms on medieval coins and found that there were two significantly different monograms attributed to Pope John VIII. Habicht argues that the earlier monogram, which he dates from 856 to 858, belongs to Pope Joan, while the later monogram, which he dates to after 875, belongs to Pope John VIII. Okay, so it's a little archaeological evidence there, not necessarily huge proof, but interesting. So, yeah. So what do you think about the story of Pope Joan? It'll be interesting to see what people who listen to this podcast think about her, if she existed. Now, again, obviously, there's a lot of controversy. I mean, I think in general, the assumption is that it's a fable. It's a tall tale. But I don't know. I mean, it's the possibility that there could have been a female pope that would have been, excoriated. And then again, in the middle of this, actually, I shouldn't say excoriated. She would have been excoriated, but also expunged from the record. The idea that she would be removed from the papal record would make a lot of sense if she did exist. And I don't know. I mean, it's right now she's sort of in the realm of folklore. The scholarship doesn't really support her existence. But nonetheless, the idea that such a thing would be postulated, I think it goes back to this idea of the woman who puts herself in this role of a man. But you know what? That's what I'm saying. We can't see this as some kind of a cautionary tale per se. The testicle test notwithstanding. But it's just the idea that a woman, a young girl, could come from Greece with her lover, in this kind of, non-approved type of relationship, dresses as a man, something also not approved. In other words, a woman not acting in her role and what they would have considered her place, which often was tantamount to accusations of witchcraft or prostitution or all other kinds of things, because it was a woman who was not acting chaste and obedient and submissive, which of course was the model feminine expectation, and also probably the social and legally established one. And she's not acting in that, but when she goes there, it's not, okay, if you're going to follow the weakness theory, she goes there and she obviously excels. She goes to the universities. She's very smart. She's so smart that she can not only teach scripture, she can teach science. She knows everything. She's brilliant, and so brilliant that there's no question that they want this person for pope. And then they find out that she's a woman. And the way that her womanhood is revealed is always through giving birth. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, so, and first of all, what would happen to this paramour? I mean, even if we want to call this, even as a legend, like, what happened to this guy? Like, where did he go? And how did her child end up as a bishop? Like, it's just those pieces, and again, we could just say, well, it's pure fiction, and this is just how people have extrapolated, but to me, like, that I feel like if this did turn out to be a real story that was suppressed, it seems to me there's got to be a lot more to this story here. Because I just don't see how she's just going to kind of wander through. Because women, it's not just childbirth that expose them, it's menstruation, it's all other kinds of things that would expose somebody as a woman in this environment. And I don't know how that, it's like how that would have just gone over everybody's head. You know what I mean? From a practical standpoint, that just seems very, very strange to me. So it feels almost more like a tale about, to me, it's another one of those tales that can almost be classed with the witchcraft tales the wise old crone tales, the idea of a woman who is acting like a man, who is too smart, and the implication would be, especially if somebody's claiming there were all these signs and omens, is almost that her appearance is like a sign of the end times. It's something that would imply the work of the devil, because obviously, a woman couldn't possibly. And the fact that they were saying that this John VIII, because he was effeminate and weak, they called him Pope Joan. That does not jive with any of the versions of this story. So I don't know. It's just very interesting the way in which the Catholic Church has tried to deal with this story, either as it's total fiction, or it was, if it was there, maybe it was said to explain a weaker or more effeminate pope. But again, none of that jives with the idea that this was a woman who came in, put on men's clothes, had a lover, excelled in university, kicked everybody's butt, and then became pope. And it wasn't until she displayed what they consider the woman's weakness, which is giving birth, which is also, interesting the way in which birth, the miracle of life that comes from woman, right? Can be treated as something kind of blasphemous and degraded at that point. And again, there just seems to be a dual attitude about that too. The child is taken and obviously becomes a bishop, if at least in this version, one of these versions. But the fact that she gave birth, just soils, corrupts, and blasphemes that whole root. I don't know. It's just there just seems to be a lot of paradox here. If there was a Pope Joan, and like I said, I would, if I'm going on the academic evidence, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot that this was of evidence as it was anything more than a tale that might have been made to shame the Catholic Church in some way, especially during the Protestant Reformation. It may have been some kind of cautionary folktale about the power of women, because we talk about the power of women in all other kinds of spheres of life. You read the Malleus Maleficarum and some of these other texts from roughly this time period and slightly later. And the attitude that women, women who are not acting in their role are either influenced by the devil, they're practicing witchcraft, they're some kind of demonic spirit. Yeah, the idea of somebody not knowing their place, and maybe a cautionary tale about what would happen if a woman came into place. But we actually also don't hear that Pope Joan's reign created anything terrible. The only thing we hear is that this particular John VIII, who is sometimes conflated with her, wasn't as strong against the Greeks for some reason. Which, again, if she was from Athens, then that would explain it, right? But that this weakness of woman is the reason. This is why you can't have a woman as pontiff, because she's too weak, right? But literally, other than her, if she hadn't given birth, would anybody have noticed? It's just an interesting legend, and the truth of it or not. Let me put it this way. As I've said, I don't know that the academic evidence is there. However, the idea that this would have been excoriated from the record at a time when, you can't talk about necessarily uniform record keeping everywhere, or certainly where information is very carefully controlled, it would also, if evidence came up later to say that there really was a Pope Joan, I wouldn't be surprised. Anyway, thank you so much for listening. If you did enjoy this podcast, please do subscribe. If you're on YouTube, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you're notified about videos. This podcast is on Spreaker, although it can also you can also get it through any podcast app and subscribe that way. If you are not subscribed, if you want to follow me on Patreon, you can subscribe as a free member, or you can be a paid member on patreon.com/Chthonia. I do occasional updates for free members, but most of it is for subscribers who will get early access to podcasts, get some Chthonia swag, and also extra episodes and other things and more updates if you want to follow me over there and provide support, which of course hugely appreciate all of my patrons because they really help me keep this work going. And speaking of merch, I do have a merch link. If you want any cool Chthonia merch with the Chthonia Crow, the Chthonia Woman, I do have t-shirts, hoodies, mugs, things like that through the Spring Store. There's a link in both the Spreaker description, and there's also a link in the YouTube video in the box below. And and if you want to check out everything else I'm doing, check out Chthonia.net. Social media right now, everybody's kind of in this kind of social media flip around. At the moment, Instagram is the best bet, Chthonia Podcast, although it does also translate over to the Facebook page. It's Chthonia Podcast, one word. It's 2 words on Facebook. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll catch you in the next episode.